So, this is a series called I Am a Failed Writer. In this series, let's just pretend that this is a series rather than just one episode that I'm trying and hoping that more than 2 people watch. So, in this series, as I talk about specific facets of writing, I want to speak just as much about ways to fail as ways to succeed, because I think it's useful to recognize all the possible screwed up paths in order to help navigate your way to the right path. Also, I have low self-esteem and I'm a bit obsessed with talking about my weaknesses, so it's convenient that way too. Anyway, today's writing struggle is about revisions. I'm going to tell you a few things about how I revise and also how I've failed to revise. How's that sound? Okay, so revisions. I've been thinking about revisions lately because I just discovered how radical a revision can be. Let me start from the beginning. I started out as a short story writer. For close to 10 years, I wrote only short stories. If a story started to get more than 20 pages, I'd just dump it. Now, I was reasonable at revising, but it was more with regard to small issues. If there was a problem with the tense, or if a character had a few inconsistent behaviors, there was one small scene that wasn't working, I could revise it. But for the most part, if my draft didn't look pretty close to the finished story, I'd just throw it out. Now, this system can work okay for a short piece, because the stakes aren't so high. So what if you wasted an afternoon or a weekend or even a month on a story? It's a little bit painful, but you can move on. Why not just stick to the stories that have some power right from the start? It seems like a reasonable approach. I'd say about a third of my stories survived. I don't know if that's a better or worse than average kind of statistic, but that's where I was at the time. But then one day, I mistakenly got myself back into a situation where I was writing a novel. This thing had legs, and it was going with too much energy for me to throw it away. This was my first novel. I'm currently working on my second. And so, once I decided I would commit myself to this novel, I did kind of have to learn how to revise a little bit better. But that particular novel was fairly unusual in its structure because it was a novel about a failed novelist writing a failed novel. And plus it had a bunch of stories within it, and even contained some of my own personal essays. So really hardcore metafiction kind of thing. And the thing was, when people gave me criticism that might have merited some serious revision, I would often work that criticism right into the novel. For instance, an agent who looked at an early draft of the novel complained, saying that a novel can't contain stories within it these days. And so I wrote that agent straight into my novel, and she became a character in the novel who criticized the Yuvi character in the story. Anyway, I'm explaining all this to say that the whole conceit of this novel allowed me to avoid revising in a serious kind of way yet again. My hope is that this method worked for this particular bizarre novel. It was a real fun novel to write, but it still didn't help me learn the art of a heavy-duty revision. But it did get me to really appreciate the novel writing experience, and it made me crave more of it. Okay, so now we're finally getting to some actual revising that I've done, or some more heavy-duty revising. The current novel I'm working on, this is a historical novel that takes place in rural Georgia in the 1930s. I wanted to write a more regular kind of novel after writing a previous one about a neurotic Jew who's a failed writer by the name of Yuvi. Now I'm actually writing about, different neurotic Jews, I guess, but from the 1930s in rural Georgia, immigrants. Anyway, So I wanted to learn how to tell kind of a more traditional story with a traditional kind of story arc. I was getting an MFA at Antioch University, and so I decided to use the bulk of this master's program to dig my way through a complete draft of this novel, a first draft. Now, along the way, I had both mentors and friends told me that the story lacked energy compared to my previous novel and other stories I'd written. And so they came at it various ways, but basically the message was it just doesn't have the same strong voice or energy to the storytelling. And I kind of knew it. I think I kind of got stuck worrying about figuring out the time and place of the story and the convoluted plot that I had created for myself. It was hard for me just to think through what would happen in 1938 in a dry goods store if this kind of person walked in. And I'm not saying that isn't important, but for me it really caused the voice to stall out. And I think plowing through a first draft, no matter how bad it is a totally valid way to get through the insane process of writing a big book. I mean, a novel or any kind of book-length piece. You need to figure out some method for getting it from nothing to completed. But the problem was that I had no idea how to ever address this major problem that the voice was lacking. I got locked into the storyline and I couldn't find the voice of the story when I did that. Okay, so now fast forward to the end of my MFA program. This is the second to last class of the last workshop right before I'm graduating. And I have this new writing teacher for this workshop. His name is Jim Crusoe. He wrote some great books, a few of them published by Tin House. I'll put some links to them. Anyway, he read the first 20 pages of my novel, and he said he liked the first 2 pages, and then the more he got into the story, the less he gave a crap about any of the characters. But rather than tell me how to fix the scene or give me some suggestions, he told me my assignment for the last class was to forget my novel and just basically write the one thing that interested him from the beginning, which was this character happened to be obsessed with writing facts about his life and about sports on napkins. So naturally I handled this feedback by getting annoyed and running to a nearby bar and ordering a few gin and tonics. But I still did the assignment right there in the bar, actually. I spent a half hour writing just about napkins, this guy's obsession with napkins. I didn't worry about the plot or the other characters or what needed to happen next, where to fit this into my novel. And the writing turned out very easy. It required very little editing. I just spit it out without thinking about it. And then I bring it, this kind of half-drunken, unedited gibberish, to the last class, and I read it to the class. There were about 8 other people, and they all thought it was better than anything they had seen. And this was so shocking and disorienting to me to hear that I had been working for 2 years on this draft, and I spent 30 minutes and did something better than anything in those 350 pages. Once I graduated the next day from the program, I just took a 3 or 4 month break from the novel. I just wrote short stories or just anything that had nothing to do with the novel. But I did return to the novel, and when I got back to it, I looked at my big pile of the first draft, and I looked at this weird assignment, and I saw it all much more clearly. The quickly scribbled assignment had a much stronger voice. It was the voice of the character that I had been looking for all along. And I had bits and pieces in the original draft, but they were few and far between. And here it was just all over it was just filled in this little scene I wrote. So I decided to use this assignment as my guide for the next draft. I put my first draft aside, and I wrote the next draft from scratch. I should say I'm still in the middle of it. I've only written a third of it so far, about 180 pages into it. But whenever I strayed from the intensity of this character's emotions for too long, which is what I felt like I tapped into in that assignment, Whenever this guy's voice disappeared, whenever I got lost in the plot, then I'd stop for a moment, think about the voice, look back at the assignment, and then retool it. I'd refer to the first draft that I'd written occasionally, like I would maybe let myself pluck out a sentence or a paragraph from the first draft, but I did not let myself just copy over a whole scene, for instance, because I wanted to rebuild the voice from scratch. This really felt like writing a second first draft in a way. The thing was, I had a lot of the plot and other details already in my head if I needed to draw from it. So I just tried to stick with letting the voice guide me for this draft. Other writers with whom I've shared this new draft really think that I've finally tapped into something that I couldn't for that previous draft. So of course this thing isn't finished yet, so I could be just as much of a failure as before. But I still find it interesting how big a change I made and what it took to get there. So what the hell does this mean to you? I mean, why am I telling you this? Okay, so here's the deal. If you're doing great revision work, then keep doing what you're doing, that's great. But if you've got some serious changes to make, I'm not talking about just like changing a guy's hair from brown to blonde or something like that, but something really big, and you think you're only making minor steps forward, or maybe even making steps backwards, and you should be able to tell this either through gut instinct or from some honest feedback from people that you trust, or both. Then I think it's time where you need to get up the courage to do something larger. Or if you're like me and you're a coward, then you'll need to trick yourself. My trick came by way of a smart teacher giving me a targeted assignment that was seemingly unconnected to my novel. But I think you can almost as easily do something like this yourself, or ask someone you trust to give you an assignment. I think the key is to find a way to get out of the way of the train that took you in the wrong direction. You may not be able to solve your problem by looking at the same problematic writing day after day. So you'll need to make up some kind of silly assignment, something low stakes, just an experiment, maybe spend a day or an hour, 15 minutes, just try an experiment. I can't tell you what that assignment is because it needs to be particular to what you're struggling with. I was struggling with voice, and so I wrote a voicey piece unshackled to the weight of my novel. So find some way to step away from your problem and then step towards it again and see if anything becomes more clear. I also think you need to go into this not expecting it to solve all of your problems on the first try. Even though my example seemed to produce some results on the first try, I've done tons of experiments that bombed, hundreds, and that's cool too. I think it's important to have low expectations from each experiment, but high expectations of yourself to keep at it. Another time, maybe I'll tell a story about how I gave myself an assignment a day for a month, but I need to wrap this up. My dad used to say when I was a kid, stop banging your head on the cement. When I was doing the same dumb thing over and over again, I just remember finding it annoying. But that's what I think about when I'm trying to do a big revision, to stop banging my head against the cement. So, where does that leave us? Anyway, how are you doing?